Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time I'm going to get to two questions that are sort of related to each other, and the first one comes to us from a psychedelic dude who asked, "Hey Thor, can you really live with the sequels being canon? I mean, when you really think about it, everything before The Force Awakens means nothing. Can you really live with somehow Palpatine returned and they fly now being the conclusion to this epic story? Even if they explain why this happens in other shows and movies, the execution of the trilogy is nothing short of horrible and honestly embarrassing. And if the shows and movies explaining and setting up the sequel trilogy are really good, won't that just make the sequel trilogy even worse by contrast? Even if the Rey movie is actually good, can you really live with Luke failing and her being the one to recreate the Jedi Order? I don't know, to me it just ruins everything and renders it all meaningless." And before even getting into it, I gotta say that you could actually make an argument that "they fly now," that line or lines, because a few of them actually say it.
Oh, they fly now! They fly now? They fly now!
You could make an argument that they're worse than the "somehow Palpatine returns" line. And I say that because in all reality, or in the story, Poe doesn't know how Palpatine has returned. He's just being honest and saying, "Hey, I don't know how, but he's back from the dead, somehow."
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And the actual reason why that line is so bad is not because Poe doesn't know, but because nobody knows. And I mean those outside the story as well. They don't know how he's back from the dead either. It's just thrown in there, Palpatine returning, in order for the movie to even exist. Those writing or making it didn't know the answer to that, so Poe kind of becomes like this surrogate for them, for those behind the movie, telling us, the audience, that no, you're not going to get an explanation for this other than somehow. We're not going to explain how the Emperor came back, even though it undoes pretty much everything you thought you knew from the first 6 movies. However, here, the "they fly now" line or lines, again, multiple people say it, those are in a way worse because they should all know in story that, yeah, stormtroopers can fly, that jetpacks are a thing in Star Wars. Finn almost certainly already knew that after being a member of the First Order for virtually his entire life. And technically, in the canon, in a comic book, Poe even sees stormtroopers using jetpacks. Not to mention, he'd also know this isn't exactly the biggest revelation in the history of the galaxy, people using jetpacks. So in a way, or again, in story, the "they fly now" lines are even dumber, if possible. But anyway, little tangent over and moving on to the actual questions, or the question of can I live with the sequels being canon? Well, in a way they are canon, and in a way they're not. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in my head, the way I deal with this, how I live with something like the rather incoherent sequels and some of the other Disney Star Wars content that's come along, even though, yes, some of it has been good. But how I deal with it is I just compartmentalize it, or sort it into different categories or different canons. I've long since decided that there are multiple versions of Star Wars, and that the connective tissue between them, or the original source, what's spawned the others, you could say, is the George Lucas Star Wars. And that original source, what he specifically created, is something separate onto itself that the others cannot impact, not for me at least. Basically, there's no two-way street here. They, meaning Disney Star Wars and even the EU, they may have come from what Lucas created, but there's nothing the sequels have done, or nothing that Lucasfilm under Disney could ever do, that can sort of retroactively change or diminish the story Lucas told, or what those films mean to me personally. They simply are their own thing forevermore. Disney may have purchased Lucasfilm, and they can call what they're creating Star Wars, and in a way it absolutely is, and I'm completely cool with them doing that. They do again own it. But it's not George Lucas Star Wars. They don't get to change what that is. Instead, they just get to create Disney Star Wars. They get to create their own version of it using the work of Lucas as a foundation. And when I call it that, when I call it Disney Star Wars, which for some reason angers some people out there and they just want me to call it Star Wars, period. But when I do that, for one, it's out of simplicity's sake to refer to what era or what version of Star Wars I'm kind of talking about. But I don't necessarily mean it as a slight or an insult or anything of the sort. I do it because, again, it's its own thing created from what Lucas did, and if, in their version, they want to alter his stories or the meanings behind them, if they really want to recontextualize or even butcher the stories of George Lucas, well, that's their right to change their version, and I'll call them stupid for it if I want to. And along those same lines, or when it comes to the EU, and to be completely honest with you here, and I don't mean this as a slight or to be disrespectful to it in any way, shape, or form, or those who worked on it, and this is coming from someone who loved it and still loves it, but I've almost always considered the expanded universe something separate from George Lucas' Star Wars as well. And I say almost always because at first, or back in the early 90s when I got into it around the age of 13 or so, and I, in my youthful ignorance, I just thought this was all still coming from George Lucas, even if he himself wasn't exactly writing it. I thought or considered it 100% genuine real Star Wars, and that was it. That was that. But when the prequels started coming out and maybe didn't exactly align with everything the EU had ever done, not to mention I was getting a little older, into my 20s, and I started to use this cool new thing called the internet, or relatively new in the late 90s, I figured out that the EU wasn't exactly George Lucas's Star Wars, that it was actually more or less its own thing, but either way that didn't make me love or enjoy it any less. In fact, in this strange sort of way, I think I could enjoy it more going forward because I didn't ever try to be beholden it to Lucas Star Wars. I was fine with it getting, well, a little out there or weird at times with what it was doing because, sure, it was still enjoyable most of the time. Yes, some of it was kind of rough or bad. But at the same time, we were also getting George Lucas Star Wars along with it. However, with Disney Star Wars now, and why I'm far, far more critical of it than I ever was or ever would be towards the EU, well, part of the reason is Disney, have taken the whole thing over now, obviously, since they bought it, and they will forever shape its future and destiny and pretty much everything about it. We're not getting any George Lucas Star Wars along with what they're doing, and probably never will again. We're just getting their version of it. In fact, they even canceled the expanded universe to give us their new version or their new canon, and now that new canon is the only one to endure or continue on, and the others will only be, well, forever be what they already are. Not to mention, a lot of people, for better or worse, right or wrong, though to each their own, of course. But many people, especially, I think the more casual or average fan, let's call them, though certainly plenty of hardcore fans as well, but many consider what Disney is doing to be nothing short of real, direct continuation of George Lucas' authentic Star Wars. And so I feel this strange kind of obligation to then point out why or how what oftentimes Disney doesn't actually align with what George Lucas did or how he'd likely have done it, or what this is all supposed to mean, what the Force means, and what we can learn from Star Wars. Which I think is what maybe bugs me the most. I don't want those original ideas and messages and concepts to be lost forever or lost to future generations who watch Star Wars, because I think Star Wars had or has and still has some very, very important things to say that, especially nowadays, young people in particular could probably learn quite a bit from. Like, for example, thinking a little less about the self and trying to, attain things like online clout, which many are obsessed with. And instead to be more about how you can just be a better person to those around you. Which isn't to say I have a problem with the younger generation. This isn't one of those things or people or life in general was better back in my day speeches. Because in many ways, they weren't. And they, the younger generation, like all generations that came before them, they're simply reacting to the world they find themselves being born into or growing into, the one we all created for them, the older generations, and they're then trying to impact it any way they can to make their own mark on the world. And I think, thanks to the internet, in some ways it's easier than ever to do that, to become something, or to be seen and or heard, and to feel special even. Though in other ways, and for the majority of people I would say, it's harder than ever to be seen and or heard, or to feel worthwhile in a world that has become, I guess you could call it a completely open forum, where everyone is shouting into the void of the internet, hoping someone hears them and recognizes them and maybe cares about them. But anyway, before I ramble on about that, though maybe I'll do a future video on this because I kind of have this somewhat funny story to tell about all this kind of stuff. But anyway, let me quickly get to that other question before wrapping up this video. And this one comes to us from Cooter Gale, who asked, "Hey Thor, meta question for you. How have you kept your passion for Star Wars? I grew up with the prequels, and only a few years ago I was probably among the biggest fans of the franchise. Like so many others, I've seen myself become estranged from the franchise that I once loved so dearly. With every controversy and every low-effort project that comes out, I just care less and less about Star Wars. However, you are always here with insightful commentary and discussions. What have you done to keep your passion alive despite everything? And I really think there are two keys here. One being that, as I've kind of been saying, nothing changes how I feel about the older stuff, about the original trilogy, about the prequels, about the expanded universe, about the games I played over the years. I was so excited to see the trailer for the original Battlefronts coming and being remastered. That looks awesome, and I can't wait to play them. And so I just hold on to that stuff, and I enjoy some of the new stuff as well, and I find cool people to talk to about Star Wars or with about Star Wars. Which is the real key here, I think, sharing it with other people, no matter how good or bad it may currently be. I still, after all these years of doing YouTube, I still take a chunk of my day to read the majority of my comments on both channels or across both channels, and I respond to as many people as I can while still trying to get more videos made and other things I gotta do. And though I know I don't advertise it much at all, or pretty much ever, I guess, but I do have a Discord server that is available to those who support me on Patreon, where every week, every Thursday night, I just chat for a few hours with anyone and everyone on there who wants to join me and who wants to talk some Star Wars and some other similar things and just have a good time with it. And so yeah, being able to share it with other people, including my wife, who I do the other channel with, and talking about both the good and the bad is part of what keeps me going. It's a big part of it. Sharing it with other people, having this be something more than just something I sit and watch and, don't ever talk about with anyone else, is probably the reason why, after all these years, after my lifetime of watching Star Wars, and after my 7 years or so on YouTube, that I still am able to do this, and I still am able to love what I do, even if I don't always love everything Star Wars. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you consider real Star Wars and what you don't consider real Star Wars, and I can guess what some of you don't consider real Star Wars. Or you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video. All you gotta do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you choose to do, leave those comments below. Let's continue to talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.